Witness this. A Roman soldier, still alive, dug his fingers into the earth, not to crawl away, not to reach for a weapon. He scooped dirt aside, pressed his face into the hole he'd made, and inhaled soil until his lungs stopped working. Around him, dozens of others did the same. They chose suffocation over waiting for the Carthaginian cleanup crews working their way across the field, stabbing anything that still moved. August 2nd, 216 BC, the plain of Cannae. The largest army Rome had ever assembled woke up that morning knowing they would end a war. By sunset, they had become the war's largest mass grave. 70,000 Romans lay dead across 800 acres of Italian farmland, their bodies so densely packed that Carthaginian soldiers walked across them like cobblestones. The killing had taken 6 hours. Not 6 hours of battle, as 6 hours of systematic execution, because after the first hour, the Romans couldn't fight back. They could only die in whatever order the geometry allowed. The consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus fell somewhere in the center, cut down while trying to rally men who had nowhere to rally to. 80 senators who had ridden to war expecting glory were scattered across the field, their togas soaked black. 29 of Rome's 48 military tribunes never walked off that plain. The dead included 2 former consuls, 2 quaestors, and enough aristocratic blood to redecorate the Senate chamber. And the man who did this stood on a slight rise at the edge of the carnage, watching his soldiers finish the work. Hannibal Barca, 29 years old, son of a general who made him swear eternal hatred of Rome when he was 9. He had crossed the Alps with elephants, lost half his army to frostbite and falling rocks, and then annihilated every Roman force sent to stop him. Twice. Now he had done something no enemy of Rome had ever accomplished. He had killed more Roman citizens in a single afternoon than Rome had lost in any war in its history. This wasn't a battle. This was an industrial accident with swords. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy the hidden truths of history, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. To understand the scale of what happened at Cannae, you have to understand what Rome believed about itself in 218 BC, 2 years before that field turned red. You have to understand why 86,000 men marched into a trap they couldn't see, are led by generals who thought size was strategy. And you have to understand the man waiting for them, a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this single afternoon. Rome in 218 BC wasn't an empire yet. That word gets thrown around loosely. But the Romans of Hannibal's era controlled the Italian peninsula and a few islands they'd recently taken from Carthage. They were a regional power with ambitions, not the continent-spanning colossus they would become. But they had something more dangerous than territory. They had a system. The Roman military machine ran on manpower. Specifically, it ran on the assumption that Rome could always raise another army, lose a battle, draft more farmers, lose a war, draft their sons. The math was simple, and for 2 centuries, it had been correct. Rome's population of military-age male citizens hovered around 700,000. Their Italian allies contributed another 700,000. That meant Rome could theoretically field 1.4 million soldiers if survival demanded it. No other Mediterranean power came close. Carthage, Rome's great rival, had a total population of roughly 300,000, not 300,000 soldiers, 300,000 people, including women, children, and the elderly. On paper, Rome was unbeatable. Any general who fought Rome would eventually run out of men. Rome wouldn't. This wasn't arrogance. It was arithmetic. And the arithmetic said that Carthage could win battles, but Carthage could never win a war. The Senate knew this. The people knew this. The allies who marched under Roman command knew this, which was precisely why they stayed loyal. You didn't bet against Rome because Rome didn't lose, not permanently, not when it mattered. A Roman defeat was a setback. A Roman war was an inevitability. This confidence had been tested exactly once in living memory, during the First Punic War against Carthage. That conflict had lasted 23 years, burned through fleets and fortunes, and killed over 100,000 Romans. Rome won anyway. They won because they kept building ships after storms sank them. They won because they kept raising legions after battles shattered them. They won because the Senate refused to negotiate from anything other than strength, even when strength was a memory and a prayer. Carthage learned something from that war. They learned that Roman stubbornness was a strategic factor that couldn't be calculated in advance. They also learned that their own government, a merchant oligarchy more interested in profit margins than military glory, would cut funding for a war the moment it stopped being economically rational. Carthage sued for peace in 241 BC, not because they'd lost every battle, but because the war had stopped making financial sense. The peace terms were brutal. Carthage surrendered Sicily. Then Rome demanded Sardinia and Corsica, threatening renewed war if Carthage refused. Carthage paid, because what choice did they have? Their navy was wrecked. Their treasury was bleeding. Their mercenary armies were already turning mutinous over back pay. One man watched this humiliation and decided it would never happen again. Hamilcar Barca was Carthage's best general, undefeated in Sicily, forced to accept a peace he hadn't lost on the battlefield. He spent the years after the war rebuilding Carthaginian power, not in Africa, but in Spain. Silver mines, client tribes, a new army loyal to his family rather than to the merchant council back home. He was building a weapon, and he was building an heir to wield it. In 237 BC, Hamilcar prepared to sail for Spain to continue his work. His 9-year-old son asked to come along. Hamilcar agreed on one condition. He took the boy to a temple, placed his hand on the sacrificial altar, and made him swear an oath. Never be a friend to Rome. The boy swore. His name was Hannibal. 21 years later, Hannibal commanded the largest Carthaginian army ever assembled in Spain. 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, 37 war elephants. He had spent his entire adult life in military camps, learning war from his father until Hamilcar died in battle, then from his brother-in-law Hasdrubal until Hasdrubal was assassinated. Now the army was his. The oath was still burning, and Rome had just given him the excuse he needed. The city of Saguntum, a Roman ally on the Spanish coast, had been meddling in the affairs of tribes under Carthaginian protection. Rome warned Hannibal to leave Saguntum alone. Hannibal besieged it for 8 months and burned it to the ground. When Roman ambassadors arrived in Carthage demanding his surrender, the Carthaginian Senate asked what Rome intended if they refused. The Roman ambassador gathered his toga in his hands. "In this fold I carry peace and war. Which do you choose?" The Carthaginian response was immediate. "Whichever you wish." The ambassador let the toga fall open. "Then I give you war." Rome expected to fight that war in Spain and Africa. They dispatched one consul with an army to Iberia, another with a fleet toward Carthage itself. The plan was simple: crush the Barcid power base overseas, threaten the Carthaginian homeland, and force surrender within a few campaigning seasons. The plan assumed Hannibal would stay in Spain and defend what his family had built. Hannibal had a different plan. He had studied Rome for 2 decades. He knew their manpower. He knew their alliances. And he knew something the Romans themselves didn't fully appreciate. Rome's Italian Confederation wasn't built on love. It was built on fear, economic advantage, and the assumption that Rome would always win. Half of Rome's military manpower came from Italian allies who had been conquered within living memory, who couldn't vote in Roman elections, who couldn't hold Roman office, and who watched Roman colonists settle on land that used to belong to their grandfathers. These allies stayed loyal because loyalty paid. Rome won wars. Rome shared plunder. Rome protected trade. But loyalty built on profit margins was loyalty that could be audited. If Rome stopped winning, the math changed. If Rome looked weak, the calculation flipped. Hannibal didn't need to destroy Rome militarily. He needed to destroy the idea that Rome was invincible. Kill enough legions, publicly, spectacularly, and the allies would start asking themselves why they were dying for a city that couldn't protect itself. It was regime change theory 2,000 years before the term existed. Break the brand. Let the market correct. To deliver that message, Hannibal needed to reach Italy. Not Spain, where Rome expected him. Not Africa, where Rome could blockade him. Italy, the heartland, where Roman citizens farmed and Roman allies watched, and Roman confidence had never been tested by a foreign army on home soil. The problem was distance. The problem was the Alps. No army had ever crossed the Alps from west to east. The passes were controlled by Gallic tribes with no loyalty to Carthage and considerable interest in stripping corpses. Snow started falling in September. Hannibal's army would need to move through hostile territory, climb mountain paths barely wide enough for pack mules, survive freezing nights at altitude, and arrive in Italy with enough strength left to fight. Hannibal knew he would lose men. He planned for it. The crossing wasn't a mistake he recovered from. It was a filter. Every soldier who survived the march would be a soldier who had already proven he could endure the worst and keep moving. The men who died in the mountains, who deserted in the foothills, who turned back at the first snowfall, those were men who would have broken in Italy anyway. Better to lose them early. He marched in late spring of 218 BC with 90,000 soldiers. He reached Italy in late autumn with 26,000. The rest were dead, deserted, or garrisoning supply points along the route. Almost 2/3 of his army had evaporated, and Hannibal considered this acceptable. The men who walked out of those mountains were the army he actually needed. Rome found out Hannibal was in Italy when refugees started arriving with impossible stories. An African general with elephants in the Po Valley, having apparently materialized from thin air. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio had been sailing towards Spain when he learned Hannibal had already left Spain. He raced back to northern Italy, gathered what forces he could, and intercepted the Carthaginian army at the Ticinus River in November. The battle lasted less than a day. Roman cavalry shattered. Scipio himself took a wound that nearly killed him. His 17-year-old son had to ride into the melee to save him from capture. Rome sent a second army. December 218 BC. The Trebia River, freezing cold. Roman soldiers wading across icy water at dawn to attack an enemy that had already eaten breakfast by warm fires. Hannibal's hidden cavalry hit them from the side. 20,000 Romans died in the snow. Rome sent a third army. June 217 BC. Lake Trasimene. Fog so thick the legions couldn't see the hills above them. Hannibal's men hidden along the ridgeline, waiting. When the Romans marched into the valley below, the hills came alive. 15,000 Romans died in 3 hours. The consul Flaminius died with them. Rome learned of the disaster when survivors staggered home and the city praetor announced it with 4 words. "We have been beaten in a great battle. 3 battles, 3 massacres, 50,000 Roman dead in 8 months. And Hannibal was still standing in the Italian heartland, still undefeated, still sending messages to every Italian ally who might be listening. But Rome was still standing too, bleeding, reeling, burying the dead in numbers that would have collapsed any other state, but standing. The Senate met and made a decision that cut against every Roman instinct. They appointed a dictator, an emergency office with absolute power, and they chose a man whose strategy was to do nothing at all. Quintus Fabius Maximus took command and refused to fight. He shadowed Hannibal across Italy, watching farms burn, watching allies scream for relief, watching Carthaginian cavalry ride circles around his legions. He never attacked, never offered battle, never gave Hannibal the spectacular victory he needed to deliver his message to wavering allies. It worked. Militarily, it worked perfectly. Hannibal couldn't force an engagement. His cavalry advantage was worthless without a Roman army to destroy. His Italian campaign stalled. His allies remained skeptical, and his window for triggering mass defections started to close. But Fabius had a problem. The Roman people didn't elect dictators to watch their country burn. They elected them to win. And every week that Fabius refused to fight, his political enemies grew louder. The delay was cowardice. The caution was aristocratic timidity. Real Romans didn't hide from their enemies. Real Romans crushed them. The people wanted blood. And in 216 BC, they elected 2 new consuls to give it to them. One was a cautious patrician named Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who counseled patience and terrain awareness. The other was a butcher's son named Gaius Terentius Varro, who had risen on a single message. The war was being lost because Roman generals were too afraid to win it. Give him the army, and he would finish Hannibal in a single afternoon. The Senate gave them both the largest army Rome had ever assembled. 8 full legions plus allies, 86,000 men. Enough to outnumber Hannibal nearly 2 to 1. Enough to crush any enemy through sheer mass. The 2 consuls would share command, rotating authority on alternate days. When they caught up to Hannibal near a supply depot called Cannae, it would be Varro's day to give orders. He ordered an attack. Hannibal had been waiting for this moment for 2 years. Every battle before had been preparation. Every victory had been a draft of the message he was about to deliver in final form. Rome was sending its largest army, its most aggressive general, its absolute certainty that numbers settled arguments. Hannibal was about to teach them what numbers actually meant when you couldn't move them. But that lesson requires understanding the ground where it was taught, the formations that made it possible, and the precise geometry of how 50,000 men killed 80,000 in a single afternoon without letting more than a handful escape. That's not a battle. That's a machine. And machines have blueprints. The simplified version of ancient warfare goes something like this. 2 armies met on a field. They fought until one side ran away, and then history moved forward. It's the version that fits on plaques and works in movies. It's also nonsense. Wars in the ancient Mediterranean weren't decided by courage or even tactics. They were decided by grain shipments, by mule trains, by how many months of dried meat you could stack in a warehouse before the weevils got to it. An army that couldn't eat couldn't fight. A city that couldn't feed its army couldn't field one. Every battle you've ever heard of from this period was really just the visible eruption of invisible logistics. the moment when supply chains and political calculations finally collided in a field somewhere and produced a body count. Hannibal understood this better than any general of his era. He understood it because he'd grown up watching it, because his father had explained it to him in Spanish military camps while other children were learning to read, and because every decision he made from the age of 26 onward was built on a single organizing principle. Rome's greatest strength was also a vulnerability, if you knew where to press. To see what Hannibal saw, you have to see Rome the way a hostile strategist would see it. Not as a city, as a system. The Italian peninsula in 218 BC was a patchwork of competing interests held together by Roman management. Rome itself controlled maybe a third of the territory directly. The rest belonged to allies, a word that requires quotation marks because it covered everything from genuine partnerships to thinly disguised occupation. The Latin colonies were the inner ring, cities founded by Rome and populated by Roman citizens who retained voting rights and cultural ties to the mother city. These were reliable. Beyond them spread the Italian allies proper: Samnites, Lucanians, Bruttians, Apulians, Greeks in the coastal cities, Etruscans in the north. These peoples had been conquered within living memory, and some within the past 50 years. They couldn't vote in Roman elections. They couldn't hold Roman magistracies. They paid taxes to Rome, sent soldiers to die in Roman wars, and watched Roman colonists settle on land that had belonged to their grandfathers. They stayed loyal because loyalty paid. Rome won wars, which meant Roman allies shared in plunder. Rome maintained roads, which meant trade flowed. Rome provided security, which meant pirates and raiders stayed away from allied coasts. The system worked because the benefits of membership outweighed the costs of resistance, and because everyone knew what happened to allies who stopped being allies. Rome didn't forgive rebellion. Rome erased it. But here was the seam in the system. On the crack that Hannibal had been studying since adolescence, the loyalty of Italian allies wasn't ideological, it was transactional. They stayed loyal because Rome won. If Rome stopped winning, the transaction changed. If Rome looked weak, actually weak, beaten army weak, burning farms weak, dead consul weak, then every allied city would start running its own calculations. How much are we paying for this arrangement? What are we getting back? What would we get if we switched sides? Hannibal's war wasn't designed to conquer Italy. Conquest required occupation, and occupation required manpower he didn't have. His war was designed to audit Rome's partnerships, show the allies that Rome could bleed, show them that Roman legions could be destroyed, show them often enough and spectacularly enough, and eventually the math would flip, and allies would defect, defections would cascade. Rome's manpower pool would shrink at the exact moment Hannibal's grew. It was leverage. Kill 10,000 Romans in a border skirmish, and Rome raises another 10,000. Kill 50,000 Romans in front of an Italian audience, and suddenly, Rome's allies start asking whether they want to keep paying for the privilege of dying alongside a loser. This was the strategy. The problem was delivery. To deliver his message, Hannibal needed to reach Italy with enough force to win battles that mattered. Spain was too far, Africa too blockaded. The overland route meant crossing the Pyrenees, traversing southern Gaul, and then climbing the Alps in autumn with an army that had never seen snow. It meant losing men to cold, to hostile tribes, and to terrain that killed pack animals and swallowed soldiers without leaving bodies to bury. Hannibal knew all of this before he started. He planned for it the way a startup founder plans for burn rate, accepting that resources would evaporate on the way to the market that mattered. He left Spain in the spring of 218 BC with 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. The elephants were partly practical, useful for breaking infantry formations and terrifying horses that had never seen them, but mostly they were marketing. Nothing announced arrival like a column of war elephants descending from mountains everyone thought were impassable. The crossing took 5 months. The Pyrenees cost him 11,000 men to desertion and garrison duty. The Rhone River crossing cost him more, fighting off hostile Gauls who attacked his baggage train mid-river. Then came the Alps. 15 days. That was the Alpine transit, and every one of those days tried to kill his army. The passes were narrow, sometimes wide enough for only 2 men walking abreast. Snow had already begun falling at the higher elevations. Gallic tribes rolled boulders from above, picking off soldiers who couldn't see the attacks coming and couldn't fight back against enemies they couldn't reach. Pack animals slipped on ice and vanished into gorges. Men froze overnight when firewood ran out. The column stretched for miles, and the rear guard spent most of its time retrieving bodies and salvaging supplies from animals that had died in harness. Hannibal walked among his men through the worst of it. Not at the front, where commanders usually positioned themselves for glory, but in the middle sections where morale collapsed fastest. He was visible, present, suffering the same cold and the same fear and the same exhaustion as the lowest infantrymen. This was calculated. An army that watched its general shiver alongside them was an army that would follow him through the next impossible thing. He was building loyalty the only way that mattered, by proving he would never ask them to endure something he wouldn't endure first. 20,000 men died in those mountains, deserted, frozen, fallen, killed by Gauls, dead of wounds that festered because there was no time to treat them. When Hannibal's army finally descended into the Po Valley of northern Italy in late October 218 BC, he had 26,000 soldiers left, 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, a handful of surviving elephants, most of which would die within months from the climate. Rome had 700,000 military-age male citizens and at least that many allies to draw from. Hannibal had 26,000 exhausted veterans standing in hostile territory with no supply line, no reinforcements, and no path home except back through the mountains that had just killed half of them. By any reasonable calculation, the invasion was already a failure. 26,000 men couldn't conquer Italy. They couldn't even hold a province. They were a raiding party with ambitions, and Rome would grind them down within a year. Hannibal looked at the same numbers and saw something different. He saw an army forged by the crossing itself, every survivor already tested beyond what Roman legions would face. He saw 6,000 cavalry against a Roman military culture that undervalued mounted troops and overvalued heavy infantry. He saw a political situation where Roman allies might flip if shown enough proof, and a Roman political system that would keep sending armies to be destroyed because the Senate couldn't afford to look weak. He also saw time, not much of it. His army would shrink every month from attrition, disease, and the 1,000 small deaths that consumed forces operating without supply lines. He needed to win battles fast, win them big, and win them publicly before his window closed. The first Roman army found him 6 weeks after he descended from the Alps. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio had been sailing towards Spain when he learned Hannibal was no longer in Spain. He reversed course, landed in northern Italy, and gathered whatever forces he could scrape together from local garrisons and allied contingents. It wasn't a full consular army. It was what he could assemble in a hurry, maybe 15,000 men, enough to slow Hannibal down until reinforcements arrived. Scipio was competent. He was experienced. He was also operating under a fundamental misunderstanding that would define Roman strategy for the next 2 years. He assumed Hannibal's army was weakened by the crossing and desperate for battle before winter made campaigning impossible. He assumed a quick engagement would exploit Carthaginian exhaustion. He assumed Roman cavalry could screen his legions long enough to bring infantry superiority to bear. All 3 assumptions were wrong. The Battle of Ticinus wasn't really a battle. It was a cavalry demonstration that happened to have infantry nearby. Scipio pushed his horsemen forward to probe Hannibal's position. Hannibal's Numidian light cavalry, the finest mounted skirmishers in the Mediterranean world, feinted retreat, drew the Romans forward, and then Carthaginian heavy cavalry hit them from the flanks. The Roman cavalry shattered in minutes. Scipio himself took a spear wound that nearly killed him. He would have died on that field if his 17-year-old son hadn't ridden into the melee, fought his way to his father's side, and dragged him to safety. That son's name was also Publius Cornelius Scipio. 14 years later, he would destroy Hannibal at Zama. But that was the future. In November of 218 BC, he was a teenager watching his father bleed and learning what Carthaginian cavalry could do to Roman assumptions. Rome's response to Ticinus was predictable. They sent another army. The consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus had been preparing to invade Africa when news of the Alpine crossing reached him. He abandoned the African campaign, sailed to northern Italy, and joined his wounded colleague with a full consular army. Now, Rome had nearly 40,000 men in the field against Hannibal's diminished force. The math was finally working in their favor. Sempronius wanted a fight. Scipio counseled caution, but Scipio was wounded and technically outranked when Sempronius's day of command came up in the rotation. Roman consuls alternated authority. On December 18, 218 BC, it was Sempronius's turn to give orders. Hannibal had studied Roman command structures. He knew about the alternating days. He knew Sempronius was aggressive and Scipio was careful. He planned accordingly. Before dawn on December 18th, Carthaginian cavalry raided the Roman camp. Not a serious attack, just enough to provoke a response. Sempronius ordered an immediate counterattack, mobilizing his entire army to pursue. The Romans crossed the Trebia River in winter darkness, wading through icy water up to their chests, and formed up on the far bank to face Hannibal's waiting forces. They had not eaten breakfast. They were soaked, frozen, exhausted before the battle started. Hannibal had positioned 2,000 cavalry and infantry in concealed positions along the riverbank, hidden by brush and the darkness that lingered before a winter dawn. His brother Mago commanded the ambush force. The main Carthaginian line waited on dry ground, warm, fed, ready. The battle unfolded exactly as Hannibal designed it. Roman infantry pushed forward against the Carthaginian center, making progress, doing what Roman infantry did well. Then Mago's hidden force struck the Roman rear. Carthaginian cavalry, having routed the Roman horsemen, swept around to complete the encirclement. The Roman flanks collapsed. The center held long enough for 10,000 legionaries to fight their way out, but the army was shattered. 20,000 Romans died in the snow that day. Their bodies froze in the Trebia overnight. Rome's response was predictable. They sent another army. The consul Gaius Flaminius took command in the spring of 217 BC with orders to find Hannibal and destroy him. Flaminius was a populist politician, popular with the common people, hated by the Senate, and convinced that aggressive action would vindicate his supporters and humiliate his enemies. He chased Hannibal south through Etruria, following reports of Carthaginian raids, never quite catching up, never realizing he was being led. Lake Trasimene sits in a basin between hills and the shore, with a narrow road running along the waterline. On the morning of June 21st, 217 BC, Flaminius marched his column of 25,000 men along that road. Fog lay so thick on the water that visibility dropped to a few dozen feet. The Romans could hear the lake to their left, but couldn't see it. They couldn't see the hills to their right either. Hannibal had positioned his entire army on those hills, 40,000 men hidden by fog, waiting in silence as the Roman column stretched out below them. When the Roman vanguard reached the end of the basin, trumpets sounded. The hills came alive. There was no battle line. There was no Roman formation. There was only chaos. 15,000 Romans dead within 3 hours, pushed into the lake, cut down on the road, trampled by their own panicking comrades. Flaminius died somewhere in the crush, surrounded by Gauls who recognized his consul's insignia and wanted the glory of killing a Roman commander. 10,000 survivors were captured. The rest drowned. It was the largest ambush in military history. 3 Roman armies destroyed in 8 months. 50,000 Roman dead. And Hannibal was still in Italy, still undefeated, still sending his message to every Italian ally capable of receiving it. The message arrived in Rome before the survivors did. A praetor mounted the speaker's platform and announced what had happened in 4 words. "We have been beaten in a great battle. No details, no spin, just the verdict." Rome's political system contained an emergency override for moments when normal procedures became suicide. They invoked it now, appointing Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator with absolute military authority for 6 months. Fabius was old, experienced, and patient in ways that offended Roman sensibilities. He took command of what remained of Rome's field forces and immediately did something no Roman general had done in living memory. He refused to fight. Fabius shadowed Hannibal across central and southern Italy. He followed at a distance, staying on high ground, avoiding open terrain where Carthaginian cavalry could operate. When Hannibal burned farms, Fabius watched. When Hannibal sacked towns, Fabius observed. When Hannibal offered battle, Fabius declined. The strategy was sound. Hannibal's army needed victories to survive, needed spectacular destruction to convince Italian allies that Rome was finished. Deny him those victories, and his entire strategic logic collapsed. Without battles to win, Hannibal was just a raiding party waiting to starve. But Rome couldn't tolerate the optics. Citizens watched their farms burn. Allies screamed for relief that never came. The Senate received delegation after delegation from Italian communities demanding to know why Rome's largest army was standing idle while the enemy pillaged at will. Fabius earned a nickname that was initially an insult and only later became a compliment: Cunctator, the delayer. Hannibal watched from across the Italian countryside, and he understood what was happening. He remarked to his officers that the old man on the distant ridge was the only Roman who understood the war, which meant Rome would replace him. Fabius's 6 months of dictatorial authority expired in late 216 BC. Rome held elections. The people chose 2 new consuls, one cautious patrician and one aggressive populist. The aggressive one had built his entire campaign on a single promise: enough delay, enough caution, enough watching Roman land burn while Roman armies did nothing. Give me the legions, and I will end Hannibal in a single afternoon. His name was Gaius Terentius Varro. His father had been a butcher. He had risen through Roman politics without family connections or aristocratic backing, clawing his way up by telling common people what they wanted to hear. And what they wanted to hear, in the summer of 216 BC, was that the war could be won quickly if only leadership showed courage. the Senate gave him an army, the largest army Rome had ever assembled. 8 legions of Roman citizens plus an equal number of allied troops, 86,000 men, supplied for a summer campaign, marching south to find Hannibal and bury him under Roman weight. The cautious consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, shared command. The 2 men would alternate authority on different days, a standard Roman procedure that assumed commanders would cooperate. Paulus had seen Hannibal's work at Trasimene. He counseled caution about terrain, about cavalry, about the open ground that favored Carthaginian mobility. Varro dismissed these concerns as exactly the aristocratic timidity that had prolonged the war. The army marched south. Hannibal let them come. He had captured a Roman supply depot at a village called Cannae in the flat country of Apulia, and he was waiting there with 50,000 men and the ground he wanted. The plain near Cannae was open, level, perfect for cavalry. Hannibal had 10,000 horsemen. Rome had 6,000, and most of those were undertrained allied contingents filling roster slots rather than genuine tactical assets. On open ground, Carthaginian cavalry would have room to operate. Roman infantry depth, the main Roman advantage, would mean nothing if the flanks couldn't hold. Paulus recognized the trap. He argued for moving to rougher terrain, forcing Hannibal to fight on ground that neutralized cavalry. Varro overruled him. They would fight here. They would fight now, on Varro's day of command. The morning of August 2nd, 216 BC, 86,000 Romans formed up on the Cannae plain, facing 50,000 Carthaginians. The Romans packed their infantry tighter and deeper than any formation they had ever used before, some estimates suggesting 50 ranks or more in places. The theory was simple. Mass and momentum would punch through Hannibal's center, splitting his army, routing the pieces. Roman weight would finally settle the argument. Across the field, Hannibal positioned his forces in a way that made no sense to observers who thought in straight lines. His center bulged forward toward the Romans, with a convex arc of Gallic and Spanish infantry that seemed to be inviting attack. His flanks held back, his cavalry massed on both wings. And Hannibal himself took position in the center, among the troops he expected to give ground. A Carthaginian officer named Gisgo rode alongside Hannibal and surveyed the Roman mass filling the plain. 86,000 men, more soldiers than some countries could field in a generation, a wall of shields and spears stretching to the horizon. "Their numbers are astonishing," Gisgo said. Hannibal turned to him, his expression unchanged. "Yes, but in all that multitude, there is not a single man named Gisgo." The officers around him laughed. The tension broke. Hannibal had told them something without saying it directly. The Romans had numbers. He had names. His army was a single instrument, forged in the Alps. He hardened by 2 years of campaigning, commanded by officers who knew exactly what was about to happen and why. The Roman army was a census report with swords. The trumpet sounded. 86,000 Romans began to advance. They were walking toward the largest tactical victory in ancient history. They just didn't know which side would be winning it. Hannibal spent the night of August 1st walking the ground where 80,000 men would die, not the center of the field where most generals would have focused their attention. The flanks, the distances between terrain features, the angles where cavalry could wheel, the places where a retreating line could bend without breaking. He was measuring something the Romans couldn't see yet, something that existed only in his head, the geometry of a trap that would take 6 hours to spring and another 2,000 years to fully explain. Here's what Hannibal understood that Roman commanders didn't. Mass was not the same as power, An army packed dense enough became a crowd, and crowds couldn't maneuver. They could only push forward or collapse inward. Roman tactical doctrine emphasized depth, rows of heavy infantry pressing forward like a battering ram, overwhelming enemy lines through sheer accumulated weight. It worked against armies that tried to hold static positions. It was catastrophically vulnerable against an enemy willing to give ground on purpose. The Romans would attack his center. Of course they would. That's what Roman armies did. They identified the enemy's main body, and they pushed until it broke. Hannibal's job was to make sure pushing felt like winning right up until the moment it became dying. The plan required precise coordination across units that couldn't see each other once battle started, commanded by officers who would have to make decisions without fresh orders, trusting that the man next to them was doing exactly what Hannibal had told him to do hours earlier. It required the center of his line to retreat under pressure without routing, bending backward like a bow being drawn, pulling the Romans deeper into a space that got narrower the further they advanced. It required his flanks to hold position while this happened, invisible to the Roman infantry, focused on the center, waiting for the moment when the angles were right. And it required his cavalry to destroy the Roman horsemen quickly, completely, and then wheel around to seal the fourth side of a box the Romans wouldn't know they were inside until it was too late to escape. One miscalculation, and the whole thing fell apart. If the center broke too early, the Romans would pour through, and the battle became a rout in the wrong direction. If the flanks moved too soon, the Romans would see the trap closing and could still fight their way out. If the cavalry took too long, Roman infantry might push through the center before the encirclement completed. Every piece had to move at exactly the right time, and Hannibal was betting 50,000 lives on his ability to choreograph violence across a space too large for any single commander to observe. He had done this before, in smaller versions. Trebia had used hidden forces and a cavalry sweep to collapse a Roman army. Trasimene had used terrain and timing to destroy another. But those were ambushes, battles where Romans didn't know they were fighting until they were already losing. Cannae would be different. Cannae would happen in broad daylight, on open ground, with both armies fully deployed and fully aware of each other. The Romans would see his entire force before the fighting started. They just wouldn't understand what they were looking at. The plain of Cannae spread flat and open under the August sun, perfect cavalry country, which was exactly why Hannibal had chosen to wait here. The Aufidus River ran along one edge, providing water for his army and a natural anchor for his left flank. A slight rise at the southeastern edge of the field gave him a position to observe without being in the fighting. The village of Cannae itself, or what remained of it after his forces had seized the Roman supply depot there, sat on a hill overlooking the plain. The grain from that depot was feeding his army now. The Romans had marched south to recover it. They had found something else waiting. 2 miles of flat ground separated his camp from the Roman positions. No hills to anchor infantry, no rivers to constrain cavalry, no forests to hide reserves. Everything visible, everything exposed. To Roman eyes, this should have been ideal ground for their style of fighting. Heavy infantry needed room to deploy. Deep formations needed space to build momentum. Open terrain meant no surprises, no hidden ambush forces, no clever geographical tricks like the hills above Lake Trasimene. That was exactly what Hannibal wanted them to think. The Roman camp sprawled across the eastern bank of the Aufidus, a city of tents housing the largest army their civilization had ever assembled. 86,000 men, most of them farm boys who'd been handed a sword and taught to stand in formation, leavened by veterans who'd survived Trebia and Trasimene and learned to fear what Carthaginian cavalry could do. 8 Roman legions, 8 allied legions, 6,000 cavalry split between Roman citizens and Italian allies. The administrative infrastructure required to feed and supply that force would have impressed a logistics officer from any century. Inside that camp, 2 men who despised each other shared supreme command. Lucius Aemilius Paulus had been consul before. He knew what defeat looked like, had seen Roman armies shattered by enemies less dangerous than Hannibal. He looked at the open ground and saw a killing field. He looked at the Roman cavalry, outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, and saw the first thing that would break. He had argued for days to move the army to rougher terrain. Somewhere the infantry could anchor on high ground and cavalry couldn't operate freely. Every argument had been overruled. Gaius Terentius Varro had never commanded anything larger than a mob of voters. What he lacked in military experience he compensated with certainty. The war had dragged on because Roman generals kept finding reasons not to fight. Fabius had let the country burn while his army watched. The aristocrats wanted a long war because long wars preserved their power. Give the people a victory, give them a decisive engagement that ended this humiliation, and Rome could get back to being Rome. The army was ready. The numbers were overwhelming. The only missing ingredient was willingness to use them. Roman military tradition rotated command between consuls on alternate days. On August 1st, Paulus held authority. He used it to delay, to scout, to look for any advantage that might offset Carthaginian cavalry superiority. His scouts reported what he already knew. The ground favored Hannibal. The responsible choice was to maneuver, to force a different engagement on different terrain. On August 2nd, command rotated to Varro. At dawn, Varro ordered the army to form for battle. Paulus could have refused. He could have invoked his dignity as consul, demanded consultation, forced a delay through procedural objection. The political cost would have been enormous. He would have been remembered as the coward who flinched when victory was finally within reach. His career would have ended in disgrace, his family name tarnished for generations. Roman aristocrats faced worse things than death, and being called a coward was one of them. He gave the orders to deploy. The Roman formation that morning was the densest infantry mass any Mediterranean army had ever assembled. Standard Roman deployment arranged legions in 3 lines, each line several ranks deep, with gaps between units that allowed flexibility and rotation of tired troops. Varro threw out the standard deployment. He wanted weight. He wanted unstoppable forward momentum. He packed the infantry together until the gaps disappeared, until legions merged into a single mass of shields and swords that stretched nearly a mile across the plain and plunged 50 ranks deep in places. From a distance, it looked unstoppable. 80,000 men moving as one body, a wave of iron that would crash through anything in its path. Up close, the reality was different. Men in the middle ranks couldn't see the enemy. Men in the rear ranks couldn't see anything except the backs of the men in front of them. The formation was so dense that if the front ranks stopped moving, the rear ranks would keep pushing, crushing their own comrades forward, whether they wanted to advance or not. It was a human battering ram. It had one speed and one direction. It could not turn. It could not spread out. It could not retreat. Varro didn't see these limitations. He saw mass, and he believed mass would be enough. Across the field, Hannibal watched the Roman deployment from horseback and understood immediately what he was facing. He turned to his younger brother Mago and began issuing orders. Mago commanded the Carthaginian left wing. the heavy cavalry composed of Spanish and Gallic horsemen. These weren't skirmishers. They were shock troops, armored riders on armored horses, trained to hit Roman cavalry in close combat and break them through impact. Their job was simple: destroy the Roman cavalry on their side of the field as quickly as possible, then ride around the back of the Roman infantry to hit the cavalry on the other side. Speed mattered more than elegance. Every minute the Roman horsemen survived was a minute the encirclement remained incomplete. On the Carthaginian right wing, Hanno commanded the Numidian light cavalry. The Numidians were the finest mounted skirmishers in the ancient world, riders who could throw javelins from horseback, wheel away from contact, and lead pursuing enemies into traps. Their job was different from Magos. They would engage the Roman allied cavalry opposite them, not to destroy them immediately, but to pin them in place, keeping them occupied until Magos' heavy cavalry could arrive from behind and finish the work. The infantry arrangements were stranger. Hannibal placed his Gallic and Spanish foot soldiers in the center, forming a line that curved forward toward the Romans like a shallow crescent, the bulge pointing directly at the enemy. These troops wore minimal armor. Many of the Gauls fought shirtless, their bodies painted, and their long swords better suited to slashing than the close-quarters stabbing that Roman combat demanded. They were brave, fierce, and entirely outclassed by Roman legionaries in a straight fight. Hannibal positioned himself among them. This made no sense to observers who thought generals belonged safely behind the lines, directing movements and sending messengers. But Hannibal understood that the center was the hinge of his entire plan. Those Gallic and Spanish warriors had to retreat without routing, bending backward under Roman pressure, giving ground slowly enough to draw the enemy deep, but not so quickly that the line snapped. That kind of disciplined withdrawal required leadership visible and present, a commander who would stand with them in the worst of it, whose presence reminded them that retreat was the plan, not a failure. If the center broke before the flanks closed, everything was lost. Hannibal put his body where the risk was highest because that was the only way to control it. On either side of the convex center, set back and angled outward, Hannibal positioned his African infantry. These were the best foot soldiers he had, Libyan veterans who had been with him since Spain, equipped now with Roman weapons and armor stripped from the dead at Trebia and Trasimene. They wore the gear of the legions they had killed. From a distance, Roman soldiers looking at the Carthaginian flanks would see what appeared to be Roman equipment, a psychological detail that would matter in the chaos to come. The African infantry would not advance when the battle began. They would stand still, holding their positions on the angled flanks, invisible to Roman troops focused on the fighting in the center. They would wait. When the Roman infantry pushed deep enough into the collapsing crescent, when the center had bent from convex to concave and the Roman flanks were exposed, the Africans would pivot 90 degrees inward and attack the Roman sides. The Romans would feel pressure from 3 directions at once, the center still fighting in front of them, the African infantry suddenly attacking from both sides. And if the cavalry did their job, a 4th direction would seal the trap from behind. Hannibal had explained all of this to his officers the night before. He had walked them through the geometry, the timing, the contingencies. He had answered their questions and absorbed their concerns. He had told them what he needed from each unit and trusted that they understood why. Now there was nothing left to do but execute. The Roman army finished deploying around mid-morning. 86,000 men, the largest military force their civilization had ever fielded, arranged in a formation designed to break any enemy through concentrated impact. At the front, Light infantry skirmishers would open the engagement with javelins and slingshots. Behind them, the massive infantry block waited. On the flanks, the outnumbered cavalry held positions they would not hold for long. Varro rode along the front ranks, visible to his men, projecting the confidence that had won him the consulship. He had promised Rome a victory, and he was about to deliver it. The enemy was outnumbered. The enemy was cornered. After 2 years of humiliation, Roman arms would finally settle the question. Paulus took position with the Roman cavalry on the right flank, the place of honor and the place of greatest danger. He knew what was coming. He knew his horsemen were overmatched. He chose to die with them rather than watch from safety. Across the field, Hannibal completed his own dispositions and positioned himself in the center of his curved line, surrounded by Gallic warriors who would spend the next several hours giving their lives to make his geometry work. His cavalry commanders had their orders. His African infantry had theirs. His center understood that they would bend, not break, and that bending was victory. The morning was hot, the August sun already pressing down on men wearing armor and carrying weapons. Dust rose from the shuffling of 200,000 feet. The Aufidus River glittered to one side. Somewhere in the Roman mass, a soldier coughed. Somewhere else, another said a prayer. Hannibal raised his arm. The horns sounded. Roman and Carthaginian skirmishers ran forward into the open space between the armies, the Velites and the Balearic slingers opening the engagement with thrown weapons that did little damage but established the rhythm of battle. Men fell on both sides, the first drops of blood soaking into dirt that would be mud by afternoon. Then the skirmishers withdrew, and the main lines began to move. The Roman infantry advanced in step, 80,000 men walking forward, their pace accelerating as they closed distance. The ground trembled. The sound of their footsteps, their armor, their breathing, built into a pressure wave that enemies described as physical, something you felt in your chest before you felt it in your body. Hannibal's curved center waited, the Gauls and Spaniards watching the iron wave approach, some of them gripping their weapons, some of them praying to gods Rome had never heard of, all of them knowing they were about to absorb the worst that the greatest military power on earth could deliver. Hannibal stood among them, visible, calm, waiting for contact. On the Roman right, Mago's heavy cavalry slammed into the Roman horsemen with a crash that could be heard across the field. The engagement there would be measured in minutes, not hours. On the Roman left, the Numidians began their skirmishing dance with the allied cavalry, darting in, throwing javelins, wheeling away, keeping the enemy occupied and anchored in place. And in the center, the Roman infantry hit Hannibal's forward curving line like a hammer striking an anvil. The Gauls absorbed the impact. Men died in the first seconds, carved apart by Roman swords designed for close quarters killing. The line shuddered, buckled, and began to give ground. Step by step, the Romans pushed forward, the crescent beginning to flatten, exactly as Hannibal intended. 86,000 Romans were walking into a trap shaped like a smile turning into a frown. The center was collapsing. To Roman eyes, this looked like winning. Hannibal watched the geometry change. The convex curve was flattening. Soon it would become concave, and the flanks would be exposed. The Roman soldiers in the front ranks pushed harder, sensing victory. The soldiers behind them pushed too, adding their weight to the momentum. The formation compressed further, men pressing against men, the deep ranks eliminating any space that might have allowed maneuver or retreat. On the right flank, the Roman cavalry broke. Mago's heavy horsemen had shattered them in 15 minutes, killing or scattering every Roman rider, cutting down Paulus himself in the chaos. Now Mago was wheeling his forces around the back of the Roman infantry, riding hard to reach the other flank. The encirclement had begun. The Romans in the center didn't know it yet. They couldn't see the flanks from where they stood. All they could see was the enemy in front of them, giving ground, the smell of victory getting closer with every step. Hannibal watched the angles converging. His center had bent far enough. The Roman infantry had pushed deep enough. The African infantry on both flanks, 12,000 hardened veterans in Roman armor, stood ready at their angled positions. He gave the signal. The Africans pivoted inward and began to march. The Roman formation, packed 50 ranks deep and unable to turn, was about to discover what it felt like to be attacked from 3 directions at once. And somewhere behind them, the sound of Carthaginian cavalry hooves was growing louder. This wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be a demonstration of what happens when an army built to push forward discovers it has nowhere left to go but down. The August sun had been up for 3 hours, and the heat was already savage, the kind that turned armor into an oven and made men drink their water rations before noon. Dust hung in the air from the movement of 200,000 feet, a brown haze that caught in throats and stung eyes. The wind blew from the south, which meant it would push that dust directly into Roman faces for the rest of the day. Hannibal had chosen his position with the wind in mind. Small advantages mattered when you were outnumbered nearly 2-1. The Roman infantry stood in their packed formation, sweating under the weight of chainmail and bronze helmets, gripping the wooden handles of their scuta shields, the heavy rectangular barriers that had conquered most of Italy. Each man carried 2 pila, the weighted javelins designed to bend on impact so enemies couldn't throw them back, and a gladius, the short stabbing sword that had made Rome's infantry the deadliest close-quarters fighters in the ancient world. The gladius was 20 inches of sharpened iron, designed not for slashing, but for punching into gaps between enemy shields, finding the soft places where armor didn't cover. Roman training emphasized the thrust. The thrust killed. The slash just made noise. Across 2 miles of flat ground, the Carthaginian line waited in its strange curved formation, the center bulging forward like a dare. To Roman eyes, it looked like overconfidence, like an enemy presenting his most vulnerable point for destruction. The Gallic warriors in that center wore almost nothing, their bare chests painted with woad. Their long iron swords held ready for the sweeping cuts their fighting style favored. Behind them, barely visible from the Roman position, the African infantry stood in their captured Roman equipment, still and silent at the angled flanks. The skirmishers had already done their work, the velites and the Balearic slingers trading missiles in the open space between the armies, men falling on both sides, the first blood of the day soaking into dirt that would need much more before sunset. Now the light troops withdrew, filtering back through the gaps in their own lines, and the main formations began to move. The Roman advance started slowly, 80,000 men walking in step, the cadence set by the centurion's calling time. The formation compressed as it moved, the gaps between units closing, the depth increasing as rear ranks pressed forward against the men ahead. From inside the mass, a soldier could see only the back of the man in front of him, the shoulders of the men beside him, the sky above turning brown with dust. The sounds of the army merged into a single continuous roar, footsteps, breathing, and the clink of armor, the creak of leather, the thump of weapons against shields. Then the walk became a jog. Then the jog became a run. And 80,000 Romans hurled themselves at Hannibal's waiting line. The collision sounded like nothing else in nature. Shields slamming into shields, Bodies hitting bodies, the wet crunch of the first javelins finding flesh. Men screamed, some in rage and some in agony, and the screaming blended into a wall of sound that swallowed individual voices the way the formation swallowed individual men. A Roman legionary named Nothing History Recorded drove his gladius into the belly of a Gallic warrior who had been trying to bring his long sword around for a cut. The short Roman blade punched through muscle and intestine, while the Gallic sword was still in motion, the geometry of close combat favoring the man with the shorter weapon. The Gaul folded over the blade, his weight pulling the Roman forward, and a second Gaul hacked down at the exposed Roman neck from the side. The blow caught the rim of the Roman's helmet, skidded off bronze, and carved a furrow across his shoulder that exposed white bone beneath red muscle. He went down, and the men behind him stepped over his body without looking, pushing forward into the space he'd occupied. This was what the first minute looked like, replicated across a mile of front, thousands of individual combats compressed into a single grinding collision, men dying in ways too numerous and too fast to count. The Gallic center absorbed the Roman impact the way a reed absorbs wind, bending rather than breaking. Hannibal had positioned himself in the second rank of that center, close enough to see the Roman shields pushing forward, close enough to hear the specific sounds of men killing and dying, close enough to grab warriors who looked ready to run and shove them back into line. His presence was the anchor that held the controlled retreat together. When Gallic fighters looked over their shoulders to see if escape was possible, they saw their commander standing behind them, not running, not even worried. If Hannibal was calm, the plan was working. If the plan was working, retreat was survival. Step by step, the crescent began to flatten. The Gauls gave ground, trading space for time, leaving bodies behind them as the Roman infantry pushed deeper. To the Romans, this felt like victory. They were advancing. The enemy was retreating. The formation that had looked so strange at the start of battle was collapsing under the weight of Roman arms, exactly as Roman arms were supposed to make formations collapse. On the Roman right flank, the cavalry engagement was already over. Mago's heavy cavalry had hit the Roman horsemen at full gallop, 8,000 Spanish and Gallic riders smashing into maybe 3,000 Roman cavalry in a collision that lasted about as long as a car crash. The Romans were outnumbered and outclassed, citizen cavalry who trained part-time against professionals who had spent their lives on horseback. The first Roman line buckled on impact. The second line tried to wheel and was hit from the side before the maneuver completed. The third line broke and ran. Consul Paulus died somewhere in that chaos. The sources disagree on exactly how. Livy says he took a sling stone to the head early in the battle and fought wounded until the end. Polybius says he was cut down by Gallic cavalry. What's certain is that he fell on the right flank, among his horsemen, in the position of greatest danger that he had chosen for himself because he knew what was coming and decided to face it directly. His body was found after the battle, stripped of armor, unrecognizable, except for the consular rings still on his fingers. Mago didn't pause to celebrate. His riders wheeled left around the back of the massive Roman infantry formation, riding hard toward the far side of the field, where the Numidian light cavalry was still dancing with the Roman allied horse. The Romans in the infantry center couldn't see this happening. They were too deep in the press, too focused on the enemy in front of them, too deafened by the noise of their own army to hear hoofbeats behind them. 15 minutes into the battle, the Roman cavalry ceased to exist as a fighting force. The encirclement was half complete. In the center, Hannibal's line continued its controlled collapse. The crescent was no longer convex. It had flattened into a straight line, and now it was bending the other way, becoming concave, the center falling back while the flanks held position. The Romans were pushing into a funnel they couldn't see, the space getting narrower as they advanced, the Carthaginian flanks now higher than the Roman flanks, the geometry of the trap taking shape. A Roman centurion, one of the mid-ranking officers who held formations together through sheer presence, took a Gallic sword across the face that split his helmet and everything beneath it, and the men around him saw their leader fall and hesitated, a half-second of lost momentum that the Gauls used to stabilize their line. Then Roman reinforcements pushed from behind, and the advance resumed, climbing over the centurion's body, pressing deeper into the narrowing space. The August heat was doing its own killing. Men in the Roman rear ranks, far from any enemy, were collapsing from sunstroke and dehydration. They had been standing in formation since before noon, packed together so tightly that air couldn't circulate, wearing armor that absorbed heat, sweating out water they couldn't replace. When they fell, the men around them couldn't stop to help. The formation kept pushing forward, and anyone who went down got trampled by the ranks behind. This was the horror that no tactical diagram captures. And the Roman rear ranks weren't fighting. They were suffocating. They were cooking. They were being crushed by the weight of their own army pressing forward, and they couldn't escape because there was no direction to escape in. Forward was battle. Backward was more Romans. The sides were more Romans. They could only stand and sweat and pray and eventually fall. By the time the African infantry began to move, the Roman formation had pushed nearly 300 meters into Carthaginian territory. The center of Hannibal's line had bent so far backward that it was now behind his own flanks. The shape of the Carthaginian formation transformed from a forward-pointing crescent into a hollow cup with Romans pouring into its center. The Africans had been waiting for this moment. 12,000 Libyan veterans, equipped with Roman weapons taken from Roman dead, standing in 2 deep columns on the angled flanks, watching the Roman infantry march past them. They hadn't moved since the battle began. They had watched their Gallic allies die by the hundreds in the center. They had listened to the sounds of slaughter getting closer as the Roman advance pushed past their positions. They had held discipline while every instinct screamed to join the fighting or run from it. Now Hannibal gave the signal, and they pivoted. The turn was simultaneous on both flanks, 6,000 men on each side wheeling 90 degrees inward, transforming from columns facing forward into lines facing the Roman sides. The movement took perhaps 30 seconds, and when it completed, the Roman infantry discovered that the battle had changed shape. The first Romans to realize what was happening were the men on the edges of the formation, the soldiers who had been marching alongside the Carthaginian flanks without engaging them. One moment, they were part of a mass pushing forward toward victory. The next moment, there were enemy spears stabbing into them from the side, African infantry in Roman armor attacking their exposed flanks with the precise, economical thrusts that Roman training had taught them. The Romans on the flanks tried to turn and face the new threat. They couldn't. The formation was too packed. Men who tried to wheel were blocked by the men beside them, who were being pushed forward by the men behind them, who had no idea what was happening at the edges because they couldn't see anything except backs and dust. The Roman military machine, built for forward pressure, discovered that it had no mechanism for sideways defense. Hannibal watched from the center as the geometry completed. His Gauls were still holding, still giving ground, still pulling the Romans deeper. His Africans were now pressing inward from both sides, compressing the Roman mass, killing the men at the edges, and forcing the survivors toward the middle. The Roman formation was no longer an army. It was a crowd being squeezed into a smaller and smaller space. And now, from behind the Roman rear, came came the sound every infantry soldier dreaded: cavalry. Mago's heavy horse had finished their ride around the battlefield. They had linked up with the Numidians. The Roman allied cavalry had fled or died, and now 8,000 Carthaginian horsemen were forming up behind the Roman infantry. The fourth side of the box was closing. A Roman optio, a junior officer at the back of the formation, saw the cavalry approaching and understood what was about to happen. He tried to organize the men around him into a defensive line, shields facing outward, pila ready. He managed to get maybe 50 men into position before the Carthaginian charge hit them. 50 men against 8,000 horses. The cavalry didn't even slow down. They rode through the Roman rear like water through sand, killing anyone in reach, scattering anyone who ran, sealing the encirclement. The Roman infantry was now completely surrounded. Africans pressing from both sides, Gauls holding the front, cavalry sealing the back. The battle was over. The killing had 6 hours left to run. The technical term for what happened next is compression. The Carthaginian forces pressed inward from all 4 directions, and the Roman formation, which had nowhere to go, collapsed into itself. Men in the center were pushed so close together that they couldn't raise their weapons. Men on the edges were cut down by enemies they could barely see. Men in between were crushed, trampled, suffocated, killed by the sheer pressure of bodies pressing against bodies. A Roman legionary in the middle of the formation dropped his sword because he couldn't lift his arm. The men around him were pressed so tightly against his body that breathing became difficult. He could hear screaming from all directions, could smell blood and urine and fear, could feel the weight of the men around him increasing as the perimeter shrank. Someone fell against his legs and he went down, and when he tried to get up, he found that the bodies above him had sealed together into a ceiling of armor and flesh. He died without ever seeing an enemy. This was what most of the Roman dead at Cannae experienced. Not heroic combat, not warrior's death, trampling, suffocation, sunstroke, the crush of their own army compacting around them like a trash compactor with a military budget. The killing was methodical. Carthaginian soldiers at the edge of the Roman mass would push forward, stab anyone in reach, step over the bodies, push forward again. The perimeter shrank by inches. The Romans inside had no room to fight back, no room to organize resistance, no room to do anything except stand and die in whatever sequence the geometry selected. Hannibal rode the perimeter as the afternoon wore on, observing the progress, issuing occasional orders, watching his army complete the work. His officers reported casualty estimates: 6,000 Carthaginian dead, most of them Gauls from the center that had absorbed the initial Roman charge. Acceptable losses, budgeted losses, the cost of building a trap that worked. Hannibal, his cavalry commander, found him at the southern edge of the killing ground and made a proposal that would echo through military history. "Give me the cavalry. In 5 days I can have you dining on the Capitol in Rome. The city is defenseless. Their army is dead. We ride now, tonight, and the war is over." Hannibal looked at the field, looked at his exhausted cavalry, their horses blown, their riders blood-soaked. Looked at the distance between Cannae and Rome and 250 miles of road that would need to be covered before Rome could organize a defense. Looked at the walls of Rome, 10 meters high and 11 kilometers around, built to withstand sieges by armies with proper siege equipment. He didn't have siege equipment. He had cavalry. "I commend your eagerness," Hannibal said, "but I need time to consider this." Hannibal's response was immediate and bitter. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You don't know how to use one." Hannibal said nothing. He turned his horse and rode back toward the slaughter still in progress. The decision had been made. and explanations could wait. The killing continued until dark. Carthaginian soldiers worked their way through the Roman mass, finishing the wounded, stripping valuables, counting the dead. Some Romans were found still alive, buried beneath piles of bodies, too weak to dig themselves out. Most were killed where they lay. A few were taken prisoner, mostly those who looked wealthy enough to be worth ransoming. The sources record that some Romans, trapped in the crush without hope of rescue, dug holes in the earth with their bare hands, buried their faces in the dirt, and suffocated themselves rather than wait for the Carthaginian cleanup crews to reach them. They chose suicide over the last hours of a death they could already feel closing around them. 70,000 Romans died at Cannae. 70,000 in a single afternoon, more than the United States lost in a decade of war in Vietnam, more than most modern nations have lost in any conflict. The dead included one consul, 2 former consuls, and 29 of the 48 military tribunes who had marched out that morning, 80 senators who had accompanied the army to witness its victory, and the entire military-age male population of several mid-sized Roman cities. The killing rate at the height of the encirclement approached 600 men per minute, not 600 per hour, per minute, for hours. When darkness finally stopped the work, the plain of Cannae was covered with bodies so thickly that Carthaginian soldiers walked across them like cobblestones. The Aufidus River, which had provided water for both armies that morning, ran red for days afterward. Crows arrived before the next sunrise, in numbers that darkened the sky, and the smell of death would linger on that plain for years. Consul Varro survived. He had fled the field when the encirclement completed, riding hard for the town of Canusium with perhaps 4,000 other survivors. He would return to Rome to face a Senate that, remarkably, thanked him for not giving up on the Republic. Roman politics had strange notions of appropriate responses to catastrophe. Hannibal stood on a slight rise as the last light faded, surveying the work his army had done. His brother Mago approached with news. Initial counts suggested the victory was even larger than expected. The Romans had lost nearly their entire force. Carthaginian casualties were a fraction of that number. It was the most complete tactical triumph in the history of warfare. Hannibal nodded, but didn't celebrate. He was already thinking about what came next. The battle had been perfect, the victory was total, and none of it mattered if Rome refused to acknowledge it. Now he had killed 80,000 Romans to send a message. The message was addressed to the Italian allies who had been watching from the sidelines, waiting to see if Rome could be beaten. Now they had their answer. Now they had to decide. The night was quiet except for the sounds that battlefields make after dark. Wounded men groaning, soldiers talking in low voices, the rustle of scavengers beginning their work. Hannibal had his officers begin counting the dead, sorting the prisoners, preparing the reports that would be sent to Carthage and to every Italian city capable of receiving them. Tomorrow, the political campaign would resume. Tomorrow, the diplomats would ride out to the allied cities with offers of friendship and threats of repetition. Tomorrow, Hannibal would begin the work of converting military victory into strategic result. But tonight, there was only the field, only the bodies, only the cost of the proof he had spent 2 years trying to deliver. He walked among the dead as the stars came out, stepping over Roman soldiers who would never return to the farms they had left, never see the families they had promised to come back to, never grow old in the villages that had raised them. 70,000 lives ended so that Hannibal could make a point about imperial fragility. He didn't regret it. This was what the oath required. This was what his father had prepared him for. This was the purpose his entire life had been shaped to fulfill. But he understood the weight of it. He understood that 70,000 dead men represented 70,000 Roman families who would never forgive, never forget, and never stop fighting until one side or the other was destroyed. Rome had learned something today. They had learned that they could be beaten. They had learned that their legions could be encircled and annihilated. They had learned that the enemy they had dismissed as a raiding party was capable of killing more Romans in an afternoon than any enemy in their history. What Rome would do with that knowledge remained to be seen. Hannibal looked toward the northwest, where the road led eventually to Rome itself. 250 miles of Italian countryside, then the walls of a city that had never been taken by a foreign enemy. Hannibal's words echoed in his mind. 5 days, dining on the capital, the war over. He shook his head slightly, a gesture no one else saw. The war wasn't going to be over in 5 days. The war wasn't going to be over in 5 years. He had killed 80,000 Romans, and Rome was going to raise 80,000 more. That was the point. That was always the point. Rome's system could absorb losses that would have destroyed any other state, unless the Allies defected, unless the Italian cities looked at Cannae and decided that Rome's protection wasn't worth Rome's price, unless the political calculation changed enough to make the manpower reservoir irrelevant. That was the bet. That had always been the bet. Cannae was the proof of concept. Now came the market test. Hannibal returned to his tent as midnight approached, leaving the field to the dead and the crows and the soldiers who would spend the night stripping bodies and preparing for the work still to come. He had won the largest tactical victory in ancient history, and he had killed more enemy soldiers in a single engagement than any general before him. And he had no idea if it would be enough. The morning after Cannae, Hannibal walked the field where 70,000 Romans had died, and what he saw wasn't triumph. It was arithmetic. His own army had lost 6,000 men, most of them Gauls from the center that had absorbed the Roman charge. 6,000 dead to buy the largest tactical victory in ancient history. By any military calculation, that was an extraordinary exchange rate. But Hannibal wasn't doing military calculations anymore. He was doing political ones, and the political math was more complicated. 6,000 Gallic warriors couldn't be replaced. Carthage wasn't going to send reinforcements through Roman-controlled waters, and the Alpine passes were closed by snow for 8 months of the year. Every soldier Hannibal lost was a soldier he would never get back, while Rome, even after losing 80,000 men, still had hundreds of thousands more to draw from. He had won the battle. He hadn't won the war. And standing among the Roman dead, breathing air that tasted like copper and rot, he understood that winning the war might require something he couldn't deliver. Rome's willingness to admit it had lost. The Carthaginian army spent 3 days at Cannae, stripping the dead, counting prisoners, sending messengers to Italian cities with news of the victory and offers of alliance. The prisoners were separated by citizenship. Roman citizens were held for ransom, their value measured in the silver Rome would pay to recover them, and Italian allies were released without payment, sent home with a single message. Hannibal was not at war with Italy, only with Rome. This was the strategy in its clearest form. Every released prisoner was a walking advertisement, proof that choosing Carthage over Rome meant survival rather than slavery. Every family that welcomed home a son or husband who should have died on that field would remember who had spared him. Gratitude was a weapon, and Hannibal deployed it with the same precision he'd used to deploy cavalry. The messages reached Rome before the survivors did. A praetor mounted the speaker's platform in the forum, and announced the news without details, without numbers, without the kind of optimistic framing that Roman officials usually wrapped around bad news. We have been beaten in a great battle. The city went into something like shock. Women filled the streets, searching for news of fathers and sons and brothers. The Senate met in emergency session and emerged with decrees that revealed just how desperate the situation had become. They freed 8,000 slaves and armed them for military service. They lowered the property requirements for legion enrollment, drafting men who would previously have been too poor to serve. They recalled every available soldier from every garrison and outpost, stripping the empire's defenses to rebuild the army that Hannibal had just destroyed. And they refused to ransom the prisoners. This decision has puzzled historians for 2,000 years. Rome had always ransomed its captured soldiers. The practice was standard, expected, a matter of honor and practical resource management. 10,000 Roman prisoners sat in Carthaginian custody, men who could be returned to their families for a price Rome could afford. The Senate said no. The official explanation was moral. Soldiers who surrendered instead of dying had shown cowardice. Ransoming them would reward that cowardice and encourage future armies to give up rather than fight to the death. Rome needed its soldiers to understand that surrender was not an option, that the only acceptable outcomes were victory or death, that the state would not rescue those who failed to meet that standard. The real explanation was strategic. Hannibal was using the prisoners as leverage, expecting Rome to negotiate, expecting the price of ransom to open a door to wider negotiations. By refusing to pay, the Senate slammed that door shut. There would be no talks. There would be no peace. There would be no acknowledgement that Cannae meant anything at all except that Rome needed to raise more legions. The prisoners were eventually sold into slavery. 10,000 Roman citizens sold to the highest bidder in Mediterranean slave markets because their own government decided that negotiating with Hannibal was worse than abandoning its own people. This was Rome's superpower, not its legions, not its tactics. Its absolute pathological refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat was standing on a pile of 70,000 bodies screaming the obvious. Hannibal had gambled that Cannae would break Roman political will. He had killed more Romans in one afternoon than any enemy in history. He had proven that Roman legions could be encircled and annihilated. He had delivered the most decisive battlefield victory the ancient world had ever seen, and Rome's response was to pretend it hadn't happened. The defections came, but not enough of them. In the months after Cannae, southern Italy began to flip. Capua, the second largest city on the peninsula, opened its gates to Hannibal and declared itself his ally. The Greek cities of the coast, never fully comfortable under Roman rule, saw an opportunity to recover their independence. Parts of Apulia, Bruttium, Lucania shifted their allegiance. By the winter of 216 BC, roughly 40% of Rome's Italian alliance network had defected or was wavering. 40% should have been fatal. For any other ancient state, losing nearly half your allied manpower would have meant collapse. But Rome wasn't any other ancient state. Rome had built redundancy into its system, had cultivated the Latin colonies at the center of the Italian peninsula as a firewall against exactly this kind of cascading defection. The Latins didn't defect. The Etruscans didn't defect. The Samnites, despite generations of Roman oppression, mostly stayed loyal. The remaining 60% was enough. Rome drafted new legions from the territories that hadn't flipped, from the citizens who remained, from the slaves they freed, and the property requirements they lowered. Within 2 years of Cannae, Rome had more soldiers under arms than it had fielded before the disaster. The dead were replaced. The machine kept running. Hannibal watched this from his positions in southern Italy, and he understood that his theory had a flaw. He had assumed that Italian allies were loyal because Rome was winning, and that when Rome stopped winning, the loyalty would evaporate. He was half right. Some allies defected, but the ones who stayed loyal weren't staying because they thought Rome would win. They were staying because they feared what Rome would do to them if Rome eventually won, and they had switched sides. Roman revenge was famous. Roman memory was long. Defecting to Carthage meant betting that Carthage would win completely and permanently, that Rome would never recover, that the gamble would never come due. Looking at Cannae, some cities made that bet. Looking at Rome's refusal to negotiate, at the new legions forming, at the absolute granite stubbornness of a state that wouldn't admit defeat, even when defeat was obvious, other cities decided the bet was too risky. And Hannibal had broken the brand. He just hadn't killed the company. The war ground on. 14 years of it, Hannibal campaigning in southern Italy, winning skirmishes, maintaining his positions, waiting for defections that came too slowly and reinforcements that never came. Rome adopted the strategy that Fabius had pioneered before Cannae. Avoid pitched battle, shadow the enemy, cut off foraging parties, siege the cities that had defected, and slowly, patiently, pull them back into the fold. Capua fell in 211 BC, 5 years after defecting. Rome's punishment was savage. The city's entire governing class was executed. Citizens were enslaved or dispersed. Capua was erased as a political entity, reduced to a collection of buildings with no self-governance, a permanent reminder of what happened to cities that chose wrong. And Tarentum fell in 209 BC. Similar treatment. Every defected city that Rome recaptured was punished with the kind of thorough brutality that made future defection unthinkable. Hannibal could offer freedom from Rome. He couldn't offer protection from Rome's memory. By 207 BC, Hannibal's position in Italy was essentially static. He held territory in the south, but he couldn't expand. He couldn't force the decisive engagement that might restart the cascade of defections. He couldn't go home, because going home meant admitting failure, and his family's entire political position in Carthage depended on the war continuing. He was trapped by his own success, frozen in a strategic limbo that his perfect tactical victories had made possible but couldn't resolve. That year, his brother Hasdrubal finally crossed the Alps with a relief army, following the route Hannibal had pioneered 11 years earlier. The reinforcements that might have changed everything were finally coming. They never arrived. Roman forces intercepted Hasdrubal at the Metaurus River, 300 miles north of Hannibal's position. The battle was decisive and brief. Hasdrubal died in the fighting. His army was destroyed, and the Romans cut off his head, carried it south, and threw it into Hannibal's camp. The sources say Hannibal looked at his brother's face and understood for the first time that he would never win the war. "I see there the fate of Carthage," he reportedly said. Whether he actually spoke those words, the meaning was clear. No reinforcements were coming. No rescue was possible. He had 14 years invested in a campaign that had accomplished everything militarily and nothing strategically. He had killed hundreds of thousands of Romans. He had proven every point he set out to prove. And Rome was still standing, still fighting, still absolutely refusing to acknowledge what he had done. The war continued for 4 more years, increasingly pointless. Hannibal holding positions in southern Italy that mattered less and less while Rome systematically recaptured everything he had gained. Then, in 204 BC, the war changed location. a Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same young man who had saved his father's life at the Ticinus River 16 years earlier, landed in North Africa with a Roman army. He threatened Carthage directly, and Carthage did what it had always done when directly threatened. It recalled its best general and sued for position. Hannibal left Italy in 203 BC, boarding ships at Croton, watching the Italian coast recede for the last time. 15 years, 80,000 dead at Cannae, hundreds of thousands more across a decade and a half of continuous warfare, and he was leaving without conquering a single inch of permanent Roman territory. The final battle happened at Zama, in North Africa, in 202 BC. Hannibal faced Scipio on ground that favored neither side, with an army of recruits rather than the veterans who had followed him across the Alps. Scipio had studied Hannibal's methods for years. He had learned the double envelopment. He had recruited Numidian cavalry, the same light horsemen who had served Hannibal so brilliantly at Cannae. He used Hannibal's own tactics against him. The student replicated the master's thesis and passed the exam. Hannibal lost. His army broke. He fled the field and escaped capture, but the war was over. Carthage surrendered on Roman terms. Massive financial indemnity, surrender of all overseas territories, surrender of the war fleet, reduction to a Roman client state. The Carthaginian Empire died at Zama. The city itself would last another 50 years, until Rome found a pretext for final destruction and erased it from the earth. Hannibal survived the peace. He served Carthage as a civilian magistrate, reforming the city's finances, fighting the corruption that had undermined the war effort. He was good at it, which made enemies. Roman pressure eventually forced him into exile, and he spent his remaining years wandering the eastern Mediterranean, advising kings who were fighting Rome, looking for any way to continue the work his father had given him. The Romans never stopped hunting him, never stopped fearing him. Decades after Cannae, Roman mothers would frighten misbehaving children with his name. Hannibal ad portas, they would say. Hannibal is at the gates. The terror he had created outlived the war itself, outlived his power to threaten anything, outlived all rational basis for continued fear. In 183 BC, Roman diplomats finally cornered him in Bithynia, demanding his surrender from a king too weak to refuse. Hannibal was 64 years old, tired, far from home, out of options. He had a vial of poison he had carried for exactly this moment. Let us now put an end to the great anxiety of the Romans, and he reportedly said, who have grown weary of waiting for the death of a hated old man. Then he drank, and the oath his father had given him 55 years earlier was finally complete. Here's the irony that history rarely acknowledges. Hannibal lost the war, but won the curriculum. Every military academy in the Western world teaches Cannae. Every general since has studied the double envelopment, dreamed of replicating it, measured their own achievements against its perfect geometry. Napoleon called Hannibal one of the greatest commanders who ever lived and spent his career trying to create his own Cannae moments. The Schlieffen Plan that launched World War I was explicitly designed to envelop the French army the way Hannibal had enveloped the Romans. Norman Schwarzkopf's left hook in Desert Storm was described by military analysts as a modern Cannae. Hannibal's ghost taught the armies that conquered the world. The empire he tried to destroy absorbed his methods, refined them, and used them to become unkillable. Rome never forgot Cannae, but what Rome remembered wasn't the defeat, it was the survival. Cannae became the proof that Rome could endure anything, that no disaster was final, that the Roman system could absorb losses that would have collapsed any other civilization and emerge stronger. The battle that nearly ended Rome became the origin story Rome told about its own invincibility. Carthage was destroyed in 146 BC, 60 years after Zama. Rome invented a pretext, besieged the city for 3 years, and then erased it. The population was killed or enslaved, and the buildings were torn down. The rubble was plowed with salt, a symbolic gesture meant to curse the earth itself. Carthage was reduced to an archaeological site, its culture scattered, its language forgotten, its history written exclusively by the civilization that had killed it. We know Hannibal primarily through Roman sources. Polybius, who admired him. Livy, who feared him. Carthage left almost no written records because Rome burned the libraries along with everything else. The greatest enemy Rome ever faced exists in history only as Rome chose to remember him. His story filtered through the perspective of the people he spent his life trying to destroy. That's what victory looks like in the long run. Not battlefield triumph. Editorial control. The plain of Cannae is farmland now. Wheat grows where 70,000 Romans died. Archaeologists have found mass graves confirming the ancient accounts, bones jumbled together in pits that suggest the hurried cleanup of a disaster too large for normal burial practices. The bones show evidence of violent trauma, skulls crushed, limbs severed, the physical proof of what compressed infantry combat did to human bodies. The village of Cannae itself barely exists anymore, a handful of buildings on a hill overlooking fields that tourists rarely visit. There's no grand memorial, no museum proportional to what happened there. The largest tactical victory in ancient history is commemorated by a few signs and an archaeological dig that most people have never heard of. But the lesson persists. Cannae proved that numbers don't guarantee outcomes, that the deepest formation can become the deadliest trap, that an enemy who understands your doctrine better than you do can use your own strength against you. Every modern military officer learns these principles, usually without connecting them to a specific afternoon in 216 BC, when a Carthaginian general demonstrated what happens when arithmetic meets geometry. Hannibal's real monument isn't a tomb or a statue. It's the doctrine manuals of every army that came after. The tactical principles embedded so deeply into military education that they've become invisible, obvious. The water soldiers swim in without knowing who first mapped the ocean. He taught Rome how to fall. Rome learned how to never fall again. And there's a darker lesson buried in the Cannae story, one that doesn't make it into the curriculum. Hannibal was right. His strategic theory was correct. Rome's alliance network was vulnerable to military shock. Italian allies did defect when shown proof that Rome could be beaten. The system did have seams, and Hannibal did find them. Everything he believed about Roman vulnerability was validated by the defections that followed Cannae. He just underestimated how long Rome could survive while wounded. He underestimated the depth of Roman stubbornness, the absolute refusal to acknowledge defeat even when defeat was written in 70,000 bodies. He underestimated how much punishment a society could absorb when surrender was culturally unthinkable. The Roman response to Cannae wasn't rational, it wasn't strategic, it was pathological, a civilization-wide commitment to denial that treated negotiation as worse than annihilation. Rome would rather draft slaves and bankrupt itself and fight for another 14 years than admit that Hannibal had won. That kind of opponent can't be beaten through conventional victory. That kind of opponent can only be destroyed completely or outlasted indefinitely. Hannibal had the capability for neither. He was too small to destroy Rome, and his own resources ran out faster than Roman stubbornness. The lesson isn't that Hannibal failed because his plan was flawed. The lesson is that some opponents won't accept the evidence of their own defeat, and against those opponents, tactical perfection isn't enough. Remember that soldier from the opening? The one who buried his face in the earth and inhaled dirt until his lungs stopped working? His name is lost. His family is lost. His village probably mourned him for a generation, and then forgot him like everyone forgets the dead eventually. But the act itself persists. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about men who chose suffocation over waiting for the end. Still trying to understand what kind of desperation produces that choice. Still measuring the distance between the confidence those soldiers felt at dawn and the horror they experienced by afternoon. Cannae killed 80,000 men to make a point about imperial vulnerability. The empire absorbed the lesson, refined it, and used it to conquer the Mediterranean. The man who taught the lesson died in exile, poisoning himself to avoid capture by enemies who had been chasing him for 40 years. The civilization he tried to save was erased so thoroughly that we can only study it through the records of its killers. History doesn't reward the teacher. History rewards whoever writes the textbook. The crows that descended on Cannae that August evening were the same species that descend on battlefields today. They don't care who won. They don't remember who was right. They just know what death smells like and what to do when they find it. The plain is quiet now. Wheat and silence and the occasional tour group squinting at informational signs. Underneath the soil, bones that haven't been found yet, men who walked onto that field, certain they would end a war, certain that numbers settled arguments, certain that the largest army Rome had ever assembled couldn't possibly lose. They were wrong. And being wrong cost them 6 hours of compression, suffocation, and systematic slaughter, followed by 2,000 years of being remembered only as the proof of someone else's genius. That's Cannae, not a battle, a demonstration, a masterpiece of military art painted on a canvas of 70,000 corpses, studied by every general since, replicated by none. Hannibal stood on that rise and watched the geometry complete. He had kept the oath. He had delivered the proof. He had killed more Romans in one afternoon than any human before or since. And Rome kept going anyway. Some enemies can't be convinced. Some lessons can't be taught. Some victories don't win wars. Hannibal learned this at Cannae. He spent the rest of his life trying to unlearn it. If you made it this far, and you've heard the story that military academies teach and the parts they leave out. Here's the question they don't ask in those classrooms. Was Hannibal a genius who lost to an opponent too stubborn to accept reality? Or was he a man who mistook tactical perfection for strategic success? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to see how Rome used the lessons of Cannae to conquer everything from Britain to Babylon, that video is coming next.